Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, you better watch out as Johnny English strikes again.
When MI7 is hacked, exposing the identity of all their agents, the Prime Minister, played by Emma Thompson, is forced to call upon a retired one, Johnny English, played by Rowan Atkinson, who is now a geography teacher. Re-teamed with Ben Miller's Boff, Johnny is assigned to find the hacker, as the country is hit by more cyber attacks. Johnny's search tangles him a Russian agent, Ophelia, played by Olga Kurylenko, and leads him towards tech entrepreneur Jason Volta, played by Jake Lacey.
The character of Johnny English originated in a series of ads for Barclaycard in the mid-90s that Rowan Atkinson did, although the character wasn't called that in them, he was called Richard Latham, although many of the other features of that character are already apparent there, including notably his sidekick Boff, who in those was extolling the virtues of getting a Barclaycard, and generally being quite annoying about it. That was of course spun off into the 2003 film, which was a James Bond spoof that notably had the James Bond writers working on it, Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, and you would think, given that those two were involved, it would be a bit sharper and more incisive and a bit more insider, generally trying to send up the mould a little bit more than it really does. It's a fairly mild, agreeable slapstick romp, but it's no more than mediocre. Atkinson has done better, but it was fairly successful, so 8 years later we got a belated sequel in the form of Johnny English Reborn, and now 7 years after that we have another one. And you must be asking yourself, well, why do we have 3 Johnny English movies? Simple. Rowan Atkinson is huge internationally. These movies do fantastic foreign box office, much like any of Atkinson's projects, because he's well known for his Mr. Bean success. And so it doesn't really matter how well these films do in America. That's irrelevant. Johnny English Reborn actually didn't do very much box office at all when it was released in the US, and it's the same case here. It doesn't matter how well this new film does in America because it's already scored with foreign audiences. Before it even opens in the US, Johnny English Strikes Again has already made $100 million, so if no one goes to see it in America, who cares? But the real question is this newest entry an improvement? Is this the best that Johnny English has to offer? No, not really. It's basically more the same. And is anyone really surprised by that? You get the nagging sense while watching this movie that they're really running out of ideas by this point. There's not much else to do with the character they haven't already done in the previous 2 entries. And you can even see that in the premise of the film, which is identical to its predecessors. All the other spies in the country are killed or otherwise indisposed, and so Johnny English has to step into the breach, and of course he's incompetent, so hilarity ensues. You would have thought they'd try to mix up the formula a little bit, but no, it's basically there to hang the jokes off of, so it just has to be functional. But you would have thought they'd try to be a bit more inventive about it. I mean, even plot beats are duplicated here, right down to the fact that the villain that Johnny is chasing is disbelieved by the establishment because he's integrated within them. That's in all the other movies as well. And it just basically follows the same formula that the other films did. This isn't really a continuation so much as just basically a soft remake, just constantly doing the same thing over and over again with new gags, essentially. It's not the worst thing that writer William Davies has ever done. I mean, he did write Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, but even so, there's not really that much to this movie other than gags. It's there to shepherd us from sketch to sketch to sketch. And so this is a movie that very much lives or dies on whether it's basically funny or not. And the simple answer is, in traditional Johnny English fashion, occasionally. And that's really the issue here, is that the reason why it feels so exhausted is because you get the feeling that a lot of the gags just aren't firing as well as they really should do. And I did sense that they'd shot a bit more material around this and they cut it. You can definitely see this in regards to the cyber hacking plot line, because I get the impression there was meant to be more sequences about that. You see the attacks on TV screens, on news reports, very briefly in passing. You get little gags like, all the trains have been diverted to Temple Meads, or you see the London Eye constantly swinging around, and you think, oh, were those meant to be entire sequences to themselves? Did they cut them at the last minute? And it does feel like the movie's got a very fast pace about it. I mean, I will give director David Kerr credit, who's making his feature debut here, although he's worked in television comedy for decades. He does keep things very punchy, very much in and out, just under 90 minutes. But even with that, it does feel a bit long in the tooth. And so a movie like this, where it's constantly moving at a clip, the fact that it does so makes it feel even more kind of sketchy and just sort of situation-based than it already is. It doesn't really coalesce into a story, even as well as the previous ones. I do have to admit that I chuckled quite a bit at this movie, and sometimes I did laugh out loud, and a lot of that is a testament to the talents of Rowan Atkinson, who I think is a comedy legend. He is easily one of the funniest people that has ever stepped in front of a camera. There's a certain pleasure about seeing him at work in much the same way as, say, Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau, and you see all of his repertoire in this movie. He commits to the gags as fully as he usually does, with his expressive face, or his ability to say the most ridiculous things with deadpan seriousness, or his ability at physical and slapstick comedy. They're all used in this movie, and with someone like Atkinson, who is such a formidable comic presence, he can elevate even middling material like this. I think that it would have to be something really dreadful to make Atkinson not funny. And sometimes there are the odd moments that genuinely work, like the introduction to English where he's teaching his pupils various spy skills. That's both cute and funny, and I think it also hints towards the fact that this is trying to play towards a younger audience than the previous entries who haven't seen the earlier films. And so occasionally you do get moments like that, but it does seem like this movie never really catches fire. Unlike the restaurant in a certain sequence where English and Boff have to go undercover as waiters and they're trying to steal a mobile phone. That's a long bit of comedic choreography and slapstick, but it keeps building and building and building, and then it fumbles the payoff somewhat, because once it does catch a blaze, the way it happens isn't really all that funny, and even worse, the way that it's staged is that it largely occurs off camera. So as a punchline, the execution is really rather poor. It doesn't impact on the audience the way that it really should do, and that's representative of a lot of the gags in this movie. There's a lot of times where it seems like it's building towards a much bigger payoff than the one that it really receives. What doesn't help as well is that this movie is really painfully egregious when it comes to setting up jokes, because it doesn't really do that so much as just blatantly signpost them. There'll be characters that go, "Oh, did you remember to fill up the gas tank? Oh, well, I guess it will be no surprise when it runs out of fuel in the middle of a car chase in the next 5 minutes." I know you're supposed to set up a gag and then pay it off, but you're not supposed to blow the punchline right from the outset, and this movie does that quite a bit. This movie really needed a brush up on its humour, and it really needs someone that knew how to stage a lot of the gags better, in my opinion. Sometimes the individual set pieces work. A lot of times, not as well as they should do. There is one genuinely standout moment though, the virtual reality goggles sequence. That is an inspired set piece that feels genuinely clever and fresh. It's full of comic juxtaposition and slapstick, and the filmmakers run with it for as long as they can, and it's very, very funny. There's a reason why they focused upon it so much in the advertising material, because the film comes to life in that part that it really doesn't for the rest of it, I think. It's a bit of comic genius, and it genuinely wouldn't surprise me if they built the whole film around that idea, because it does seem like that to a certain extent. The theme of this movie is definitely technology. A lot of the jokes are built around gadgets or Johnny not knowing how to use tech, like the fact that he doesn't know how to use a modern smartphone. The film positions him as an analog hero going up against a digital villain, and in this film's case, the antagonist is dreadfully lame, and considering that his forebears are John Malkovich doing a French accent and Dominic West doing whatever Dominic West was doing in Johnny English Reborn, that's saying something. Jake Lacey plays this Elon Musk-esque character called Jason Volta. That's right, Jason Volta. They really were that lazy with the name. The film has a couple of pot shots at the internet and modern security culture, but this villain isn't intimidating and he isn't particularly funny. In fact, Lacey is actually really wooden. Some of his line deliveries are terrible. And yeah, his plan doesn't make any sense, even by this movie's standards. Apparently he's gonna take over the internet or something, but really it's just an excuse for a lot of old man yells at cloud style gags about technology, like the fact that Johnny drives a vintage red Aston Martin in this movie that is actually owned by Rowan Atkinson in real life. That seems purely there so that he can drive his own car because he's a massive aficionado and to get a couple of jokes at the expense of hybrids and electric cars. Elsewhere, you have this Q-like character whose one joke is constantly asking them to fill in health and safety forms. That is tired and hacky, even by sitcom standards a lot of the time. And the emphasis on this theme really seems to me like a series struggling to remain relevant. Where this movie more succeeds on that count is in Emma Thompson. She plays the Prime Minister that is clearly modelled on Theresa May. They do not even try to hide it, and she has the mannerisms down to a T. Once you figure out that's exactly what she's doing, it's really, really hysterical. She's this clueless but very agitated and flustered PM that is just inundated with bad news that is only getting worse, and she's just hoping for something good to happen, and it builds up until eventually she snaps at English in what I think is a standout moment where she finally reveals the pressure that she's under in just this tirade where she can barely conceal the palpable anger and frustration that she has. And Thompson steals a lot of her scenes in this movie, playing what is essentially very spot-on satire, in my opinion. This is a good example of timely, topical jokes that work a lot more than the tech stuff. Olga Kurylenko, of course, is cast because she was the Bond girl in Quantum of Solace, and I wish the film took a little bit more advantage of that and tried to bring her into the comedy more than it does, because a lot of the time she's playing the straight woman to Atkinson. There is one major comedic set piece with her where she's trying to kill Johnny English, and a lot of the time he's bumbling through her attempts completely obliviously because he's pepped up on pills. That's quite funny, but it doesn't really make sense in the grand scheme of the movie, because why is she trying to kill him when they're working together for the rest of the running time? But I guess funny's funny. I like they brought Ben Miller back as well. He wasn't in the second film. Apparently he did shoot a cameo, but it was cut. But his role in that was filled by Daniel Kaluuya, pre-Get Out. He probably doesn't want you to mention that these days. But it's nice to have Miller back. I think that he serves quite well as a straight man to Atkinson. They have a good chemistry together. And if you remember seeing the first movie 15 years ago in cinemas like I have, it's a nice little twinge of nostalgia. What I do think this movie really should have done to make itself feel a lot more relevant and timely is update its James Bond references. It still spoofs a couple of things from classic Bond movies like GoldenEye and Thunderball, but you would have thought they'd try and take advantage and spoof the Craig films a bit more directly. They've made quite a few of them now. You can mine a bit more of that material for jokes, and yet not really. They're just pretty much doing the same thing that they always do, and that makes it feel even more stale and out of date than the character is. Johnny English Strikes Again does have some amusing moments, but the well really is starting to run dry by this point. Even with its sub 90-minute running time, this feels exhausted by the end of it. And Atkinson makes it work, but this was never his greatest comedic creation, always feeling like a second banana Austin Powers. If you like slapstick and are fairly undemanding, or you've got some younger viewers to entertain, this might get a few laughs, but I do think the character should be retired after this outing. Although he may come back in a few years' time for another movie, maybe he'll do his version of Never Say Never Again, because that's certainly true of this franchise. Wait, wasn't Rowan Atkinson in that movie too?
Johnny English Strikes Again brings the inept spy back once more, but it's clear this James Bond spoof is just as out of date as its main character is. Despite Atkinson's efforts, and it is hard not to chuckle at his rubbery faces, even the slapstick set pieces feel undercooked and uninspired, never quite delivering the huge laughs they build towards. Only one sequence where Johnny wreaks havoc while wearing VR goggles genuinely shines, but even with a focus on technology by way of a weak Elon Musk-esque villain, most of the gags are obvious and heavily signposted. Emma Thompson's steal scenes with a parody of Theresa May, although Olga Kurylenko doesn't get to riff enough on her Bond girl image, and the film still does classic 007 spoofs instead of sending up the more current Craig films. It's a weak outing that shows that they're running on fumes, although they might make another one in 7 to 8 years, so who knows.
If you like this review, then your next mission is to go to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.